Hi everyone, here's what's bothering me today.
El Perú es un nuevo epicentro de confrontación. Confrontación entre el comunismo y una economía libre, entre el control de la prensa y la libertad de expresión. Y hoy que tengo la oportunidad de estar frente a la prensa internacional, quiero también dar mi mensaje al mundo de lo que significa esta batalla para nuestro país. Esta segunda vuelta no es solamente entre Keiko Fujimori y Pedro Castillo, sino estamos enfrentando también al partido político, como además ellos se autodenominan, marxista-leninista Perú Libre, hoy represente a todos los peruanos en el intento de que Perú no se convierta en Venezuela.
So that is far-right fascist leader Keiko Fujimori, son of former dictator Alberto Fujimori, who is openly again calling for her friends in the CIA to coup the rightful winner of the Peruvian election and trying to use all the same talking points of, this is a front for the battle between good and evil and we don't want it to become like Venezuela, when really more Peruvians are more like, can we just kind of have more of the equitable stake that the people over in Bolivia got for a while there under Evo Morales? That's kind of what we'd like. But no, instead, it's got to be this whole big thing. And oh, it's so dangerous. And I want to overturn a fair election despite using points about fair elections. It is just so ridiculous. Anyway, welcome to the Sunday Sum Up, everyone. There is really a lot to get through. So I think we're going to hit all the terrifying American stories first, and then we'll bring it up here to Canada for even more terrible stories. So keeping it ever so slightly international for a moment, there's this fun little fact from Uber Facts. Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, is worth more than the GDP of over 140 of the 195 nations on Earth. So now let's move on to even more American news. So one of the things I saw this past week was this piece from CNN about how after hours of debate and public comment, the Florida State Board of Education unanimously approved the amendment banning critical race theory. A lot of Republicans seem to ban critical race theory, A, because it makes them uncomfortable because it really exposes capitalism for the brutal and terrible, unjust system that it is, while also pointing out that systems can be inherently racist rather than it just being an individualistic attitude, which is an outlook or a worldview that conservatives really love. So of course it doesn't jive with them. Either way, it is very telling that these people who crow about freedom of speech and democracy and the free marketplace of ideas are doing everything they can to prevent that from actually happening. In other terrible news from America, apparently Alabama is working on a nitrogen gas death chamber. The basic premise is that it would just pump a sealed room full of nitrogen and you'd slowly suffocate. This is seen as humane. But imagine being the person who has to go through and make sure, yeah, no, this all looks to be safe and good enough to kill people through asphyxiation. Yeah, totally cool and a normal thing a progressive Western developed society should do. Moving to a different part of America, there was this really terrifying story of how sheriffs deputized as federal agents ambushed and killed a 32-year-old man in uptown Minneapolis in a parking garage. They just surrounded his vehicle and then basically opened up. It was just basically a police death squad. Initial claims by authorities and corporate media said he was a murder suspect and that he produced a gun, but both of these were proven false. They just killed a man in cold blood. Are you kidding me? And again, in Minneapolis, which in many cases is ground zero for the Black Lives Matter movement for the past year because of the death of George Floyd. Absolutely ridiculous. So if you're wondering why there's protests in Minneapolis, it's because of this police death squad. And we're not even really done with America. This last one is kind of a tally of stories. This was done by an account called Tracking Biden from the Left. And you know what? We often don't talk enough about the Biden administration on this channel because it's supposed to be mostly Canadian focused and then whatever other stuff I see that comes my way. But over the past week, you can argue that, according to this person, they're absolutely right when they say that today has been the worst day of the Biden presidency thus far. So they made this whole thread, and so we're going to go through this. 1. Joe Biden's Border Patrol using helicopter rotor wash to try to clear out activists. A Trumpian act by the Biden administration. Helicopters should never be used to clear people. We also touched on this in my Line 3 pipeline video. Then there was Kamala Harris telling migrants, do not come. Do not come. We will enforce our laws and secure our border. So what's the difference between Biden and Trump exactly when it comes to a lot of the policy stuff? Next up, number 3, President Biden's DOJ is continuing to defend Trump in the defamation case that accuses him of raping journalist E. Jean Carroll. So, there's that. Number 4 is Joe Biden supporting a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court that blocked immigrants in the U.S. on humanitarian grounds from getting permanent residency if they entered illegally. So again, this brings up the question of what happened to asylum, which is a universally agreed upon principle. This is just racism. It's institutionalized racism. That's all it is. And then one more that they dug up, and this is really just the horrifying icing on the cake for this one. ICE detainees are being disappeared, according to a letter to ICE government from lawyers for New York immigrants. They were moved without warning, and so their attorneys and legal reps did not know where they were or where they're going. And I'll remind people that this is just yet another instance of the horrifying history of people being detained by ICE, being abused, going missing, being sent to the foster care system with no tracing for where these kids may or may not end up. It is just a monstrous situation. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Oh, and one more thing about America. Half of it's on fire. This drought is way worse than the same levels of drought that were happening last year. So it's going to be a really terrifying summer in half of the continental United States. So let's bring it on north of the border. So we're going to start here in my terrible home province of Ontario, where our premier, Doug Ford, decided to invoke the Constitution's notwithstanding clause after judges rejected his election finance reforms that tried to basically what happened was Doug Ford was really unhappy that unions could spend a lot of money to point out all the ways in which his government is terrible to unions and your average working class Canadians, and how he really isn't an ally of the working class at all. Since that hurts his image and his brand, he decided to try and pass a law that would limit their funding and spending. A judge struck it down. So Doug Ford is using a kind of nuclear option, which is the notwithstanding clause in the Constitution, to bypass the judge's ruling, which said that his previous attempt at this law was unconstitutional. In other words, my premier, Doug Ford, is trying to use the Constitution to push through an unconstitutional act. And if you're thinking that should be illegal, you're right, it should be, but welcome to Canada, everybody. And again, to remind people how terrible this man is, with more news that came out of this province, COVID-19 deaths piled up at this long-term care home, and this long-term care home missed deadlines to fix the infection control, and it just led to so many more problems. This long-term care home took 2 months to implement concrete action and reforms that would have saved lives. Blood is on their hands, and is on the hands of the government, which refused to fix this and address this meaningfully in the past, cutting funding, and just so many other terrible things that conservatives have done, and even liberals have done, or rather haven't done, over the past decades now. So yeah, Ontario's not in a good place right now. And then finally, in a little bit of a lighter tone, I leave you all with this.
Thank you so much to the 68% of Albertans who have gone out of their way to get at least their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. Thanks to you, we crushed the spring spike of COVID, and we are starting to get our lives back to normal. But folks, we have a bit of a problem. I'm here at the Edmonton Expo Center, one of our big rapid flow-through vaccine clinics, on a Saturday afternoon, and no one is here because we're not getting enough demand right now. And that's why Alberta Today is announcing that we are launching the Open for Summer vaccine lottery. with 3 $1 million prizes and a range of other exciting prizes that will be announced in the days to come. The first installment of the Open for Summer lottery will be open to all Albertans aged 18 and over who get at least their first dose of vaccine within 7 days of us hitting that critical 70% threshold for first dose vaccines. So please do your part, because now a vaccine shot is also your shot at $1 million. And you can help to keep yourself, your friends safe, and help us all to get back to normal.
So yeah, you heard Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, correctly. In order to try and get more people jabbed in Alberta and get over this vaccine anxiety from QAnoners and conservatives, they're hosting a lottery where you can win up to $1 million for getting jabbed. Now, on the one hand, this is probably, I hate to say it, but it's probably a good way to get some conservatives jabbed because, oh, I don't know, it's, Bill Gates and put a microchip in mind-controlled devices. But hey, chance at $1 million. Like, if that gets people vaccinated, I'm cool with it. But it also really speaks to how terrifying and desperate the situation is over in Alberta, that this is seen as a viable solution from the Premier and his cabinet and office. That people need to be bribed with money to get a vaccine, and that the current system and all the bungling that his government has done before has resulted in the need for this in the first place. It's just yet another capstone on another terrifying and frankly exhausting week in the world. Between the nonsense going on in Peru and many other corners of the world I didn't even touch on, and all the terrifying and horrifying news from the States, and then again, more horrifying pandemic-related news from up here on this side of the border, it really just shows that this model of neoliberalism that was touted as the way forward in the 80s has just proven itself to be a massive and spectacular failure. It is clear across the continent, across the hemisphere, across the world rather, that this system has been good for a handful of people, and it has overwhelmingly disenfranchised and made the world more precarious. It is not a good system, and yet unfortunately we still have to deal with nations and states and provinces and the people who control them hyping up this system when, as we've seen over the past few weeks, it all touches on a lot of the same points, which is that this isn't a good system. Something needs to change. It needed to change decades ago, and the fact that it hasn't is definitely what's bothering me today.